right. Hello, everybody. Hope you're all, your stomachs are full after the lunch. My name is Jakub Steiner, and I'm a visual designer at Red Hat. And I'm going to give you a talk on how I use Blender for doing user experience design. So to tell you, because like all you've seen here was amazing presentations on, TV production and short film and film production, wowed by Blender's amazing capabilities in that main area of focus. I'm going to be talking about using it in a completely different environment. So what is design? Like when I talk to people outside of my professional field, they're always confused at so you do these fancy-looking things that cost more than the usual stuff. But that's the main misconception about design being something that focusing on how things look and feel, rather than what design is, which is how things actually work. So it's kind of system analysis, figuring out what the thing should be doing, and then focusing mainly to deliver that promise. But user experience is slightly wider in that it adds the actual experience while working with the product. So it's not just functionally delivering, but also the whole experience should be pleasant. So that's the fluff that's on top of it again. I'm going to be talking about how I use Blender to design GNOME. So what is GNOME? Now, even that is slightly hard to answer because officially the thing that GNOME is a desktop environment. I'm going to ask, raise your hand if you've ever heard of GNOME. Okay, so I actually have an audience that is familiar with GNOME is. So the way we distribute software is kind of very weird, and the term desktop environment is being used while in effect, what I like to, if I'm talking to somebody who doesn't know, it's an operating system. It's something that allows you to run applications, switch between them, and generally do what you want to do rather than fiddle with the computer. Because I'm surrounded by super talented 3D artists, I have to, confess that I am a Blender rookie. To my defense, I've only been playing with Blender since 1999. The closest thing to being a 3D person was when I worked at my previous employer, Novell, when we had this web service. Again, it was related to operating systems, so we allowed people to build their own operating system appliance. And it was running all in the browser, and I kind of escaped my comfort zone. Not that I'm a brilliant illustrator, but I escaped the realm of 2D to create the aesthetic and the brand around SUSE Studio, and I tried it in 3D, and it sort of kind of worked, but it's like a very simplistic or very shallow knowledge of all the things that you need to master to be able to create a character and rig it. So I kind of had a rig, and I could kind of sort of pose the character, but it was only for static images. You definitely wouldn't want to animate the thing. So I did a little bit of that, but surrounded by all this talent, this is really not what I brag about. But you might have ran into something that I did, work on, and that is, this thing. I I wasn't sure about GNOME being well known here, but I think you guys know this. So this is the application icon. I did not design the logo, but I did do the app icon, and I happen to also have created icons for the other free software graphics tools that we tend to call the Libre Graphics Suite, although they're not really very related, except that they're freely available in open source. So GIMP, Inkscape, and MimePaint. This icon itself is not made in Blender. It was done in Inkscape with a vector workflow. I've been doing icons for ages now, and most of the stuff back then, we had low resolution screens, so you had a raster image or bitmap workflow where you focused on the pixels. Then we moved to the vectors because it allowed to easier create all the size variants and create derivative works, assemble assets. And then, well, you're talking at a 3D conference. Did you try, to incorporate Blender into your workflow? Well, why? Yes, I did. Because, usually there's a certain aesthetic linked to 3D, and it was kind of a little bit off from what we've been doing. And for icon design, you're not really just creating pretty artworks. You're trying to maintain a consistent style and have the apps kind of form a common ecosystem. And I wouldn't have experimented with 3D for icon design if it weren't for WebOS, which has been quite an inspiration for the GNOME project as a whole. And there's a couple of apps that did. Of course, what you're not seeing, because I didn't prepare all the stuff, we still cared about the low res. So all the low resolution icons were still touched up in a vector editor, but caring for the raster grid. So that was icons. The 3D assets actually allowed to do some additional things to just creating the icon. So as the vectors helped creating, the different sizes and extra derivative icons, the 3D allowed us to do additional assets, like for the sort of app center software we call, banners, and this is an icon for an IDE that we have in GNOME called Builder. And Christian Herget, back when he had the idea of quitting his job and creating this thing, needed a Kickstarter. So we sort of did this Kickstarter video. So I used the assets from the icon to help create that little video. Another tiny little thing that I was using Blender for were the cursors. There's all sorts of animated elements in there, and this stuff is actually quite ancient. We don't use this anymore, but it keeps popping up. Like when I was booking accommodation for this trip, I used a service called booking.com, and they're using the spinner that I designed. So that actually reminded me that, yeah, I also used Blender for this. So it's like the compositing was done, the rendering of the little spinner was done in Blender, and then compositing also in Blender as well. Another part where Blender is being used is wallpapers. So we don't do it's a large part of our branding. We don't slap logos all over the interface, but we sort of have a consistent, like I said, we have a consistent consistency, but this we kind of switched in between. But we used to be all about stripes. Now we're all about triangles, or when I'm in a 3D conference, trees. So all the wallpapers throughout our releases have been done in Blender. And I just showed you a few. They're all like different lightness. That's because we actually have something called time-aware wallpaper, where the wallpaper changes throughout the day. So at night it's more toned down, and it's not blasting color at you. But you saw that the sort of aesthetic for the wallpaper is very subtle, and you could just as well use a vector editor for doing these kinds of designs. Why did you choose a 3D package? Well, for GNOME, we also, like, apart from targeting workstations, our main platform are notebooks, and we also like target very low price range displays, and those displays have very narrow color gamut, the amount of colors that they can display, and you run into an issue of color banding. If you're having subtle gradients, not too much contrast in the design, then you run into this horrible artifacts, which when you're using cycles and Blender, you get noise for free, which kind of helps with the color banding. Well, I kind of had a workflow that involved working in GIMP and HDR, and then just crushing the colors using a plugin that Hans-Peter wrote. But it was all cumbersome, and really just like doing things in Blender has worked out really well. It really works great for the dithering. Unfortunately, Inkscape, my choice for illustration or vector package, doesn't do any kind of dithering for the blends, for the gradients. So that really isn't very helpful. Apart from the default wallpapers, there's additional wallpapers that we're shipping, and one of the stuff that I should mention that Blender provides that I really love is, because all the wallpaper stuff is not like you have a clear vision of what you want to do. You're just experimenting and see where it takes you. So with the tools that Blender provides, it's very easy to experiment. So this is a very simple grid of icons that GNOME ships with as a wallpaper, and I'm using the what's it called? The emitter, particle emitter, to distribute objects that are in a group. And the great thing that it has is that you can weight distribute individual objects. So you can define like what kind of asset you want to see more of, what kind of less of, and it's really great. The other huge area that we use, that I use Blender for, and I did a talk in Madrid a couple of years back, is that we also, because a couple of years back, we did a huge redesign of GNOME, because the time was right. The new GPUs were starting being readily available, and we wanted to have a more modern shell to launch and switch applications. But it was a huge departure from what we had before. So there was no, Windows 95-like taskbar or Mac OS Dash to switch between applications, because we wanted to have a very distraction-free environment where if you're working in an application like Blender, there would not be any kind of Chrome going into your session. It was only when you actually were ready to launch a different application or switch to a different thing, you would go into something called Overview. But the thing is that this thing was different. And let me tell you, we have experience of people not liking to change. It's like, how do you get the essentials to people, to learn how to do the things the new way? Apple does it in a great way of showing you, how super easy, when they launched the iPhone, how super easy it is to zoom things with just your fingers. And they even could use the I word, intuitive, while all it is they're actually showing you how to do that. Like, there's nothing intuitive about it. It's all about being able to, being familiar with something. But they're doing it in a great way. So the best way to teach people how to do things is to show them. And so we had a project called Getting Started, which aimed to do exactly this. We couldn't do because people don't actually download GNOME from our website. We can use that to show people how you actually launch apps. But we did have a little thing once you install the system that showed you just a couple of essential things that could get you started, which is what they're called. Unfortunately, there's a big price to pay if you're using a video demo or even an image, a screenshot, because you have to maintain it. And we have a very fast release cycle. We do a new release every 6 months. So stuff changes. And if you would be showing something that you weren't able to update in time, so even just the wallpaper being different, it kind of ruins the experience if you're trying to show something and it's different to what you're actually having in front of you. So we try to go away from being realistic or high detail into a little bit of abstract. And another huge part of this was also translations, because people, they don't care about translations, they just want the thing in their native language. So the task was to create a thing that would show the basics of how the system works, and wouldn't be so hard to maintain. And this is what we came up with. Again, Blender was used to create this thing, including the translated, try to minimize the amount of strings that were necessary. But we also had for languages that weren't supported, because this is immense complexity to using language. We had subtitles that worked, and this is a very a simple animation. But again, you start with thinking that it's going to be a simple thing, and it ended up being very complex. The part that ended up being complex was the data overload, because even a simple animation like this that ended up being a few kilobytes as a final animation, you try to you start with running it locally with all your Blender computers, setting up your simple render farm. Trying to have multiple machines working at the same time, so you used PNG frames, and then you realize you're whitelisting a few languages, and then it grows to a couple of gigabytes. Can't probably see. So the translation was done in a way so that it fitted into our existing translation infrastructure. So translators would be just doing the same thing as they were. So I exposed the strings in an XML document. Of course, not my choice of a data store, but again, it was to drop in an existing infrastructure. Again, if I was saying that I'm not a 3D person, I'm definitely not a programmer, so maybe I should switch away from this as quickly as possible. But it was just a couple of scripts that would replace the strings, render everything into PNG stills, and then have the sound mix, and then use GStreamer back then, because like FFmpeg in Blender was kind of flaky, and so we used an external tool to do those. That was a kind of a big part of how we used Blender for. But the main thing that I want to talk about here is how we use Blender for doing the actual how do things work, the design part, and that is to create animated prototypes of future functionality. It was when I started, I had the idea of using the internal GLSL shading in the viewport to render it out because it was real time. I wanted to have a tool to quickly sketch out ideas in time, so like the next dimension to doing it in space. But it turned out that there were some complications with that approach, but still, like it was generally a success. I want to briefly talk about like the purpose of these prototypes. Usually, when you're designing, it's not a finite process where the designer works for a long time and then comes up with a solution and tells the engineer, the developer, this is how it's supposed to do, how it's supposed to work. Here, take it, make it happen. Usually, that is an involved process for both parties. Of course, there is this stage where the designer just scratches his head and tries to come up with some solutions. But then the actual design process happens with both parties. The designer needs to know the constraints of the technologies that they're using. So to be able to quickly run through various designs, typically a wireframe is being used. A different kind of wireframe than in the 3D world. It's just a rough idea of the individual elements, and then sometimes, depending on the use, you do a full-fledged prototype of how things actually look rendered, in high fidelity. For GNOME 3, we were in a kind of tricky situation where we didn't just want to convey how things work, we needed to sell the idea that we do need, a 3D shell, and we do need transitions because they do help the user to figure out spatially where things are. We had concepts like workspaces back then, but our testing showed that people were just confused so workspaces worked like a grid of desktops where they would take you to a different place so you could have a different set of application windows and work concurrently on multiple things. But it was a 2D world. It was just a binary switch between one state to the other, and most people thought that their applications crashed because they went away. With transitions and with a spatial model, you could show that those apps exist somewhere. They're populating the grid, but when they go away, they live somewhere else. When you're just transitioning between the workspaces, you don't lose track of where stuff is. So that's one thing. And the other thing was, for the high fidelity, we needed people to come in and help us build the thing. So it was both used for design, but it was also a promotional tool because people get interested if they see flashy things and they see, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. This is how things could work. So that's why we kind of did the wrong approach of investing effort into fleshing out details that then were thrown away. This is the kind of rough wireframing. It's clipped actually on top, but this is the rough wireframing that usually is used, so you just get an idea of how things work rather than having a full-fledged image. This is another prototype of something that we don't quite have yet in this state, but for the file manager, there's the path bar, the sort of location of where you are on the file system. So it was one of the prototypes to show how to navigate the same problem that I was talking about, people being confused when they first booted up GNOME. Where's their applications? So this is kind of a different approach to the same problem. Rather than showing them a video of where stuff is, at boot time, as your system is coming up or after logging in, the apps. I mean, this is slightly over the top, and there's too many elements, happening. But this is the only version that I found. So as the system is booting up, the apps kind of come out and hide where they reside, so it gives you a hint of where stuff is when you want to launch stuff. This is another visual mock-up of editing in an application. This is, by the way, Christian, who is responsible for Builder, the IDE. And so this mock-up was created because the toolkit back then wasn't really able to be doing all these scaling things. So this is kind of a ideal scenario of how the application editing could work. And if you run photos these days, we actually have that done. This is another mock-up of how full screen could be working. Hiding all the Chrome, the controls when you're actually viewing stuff. This was one of the few, you can't actually see it because the projector doesn't do 60 hertz, but it was like one of the few examples where I tried to keep the frame rate at 60 rather than using cheap tricks like motion blur that I usually do, so I don't have to wait for the renders that long. So that was just a couple of examples of the animated mock-ups, prototypes that I sort of work with the engineers to get those features realized. I'm just going to quickly go through some of the things that Blender has that enabled me to do this. And I was going to talk about how animation itself has all the tools for the purposes that I need, but unfortunately, I have to start with this one. That's a big saver when you're working with textures. I have to use an add-on because, without this add-on, I would spend so much time just trying to, get the aspect ratio of a plane with a texture and just setting up the materials. This add-on is a lifesaver. Thank you, whoever worked on that. Another huge improvement that happened during my experience doing the prototypes is SVG Import, which has improved immensely compared to what it was a couple of years back. It would get all funky, and now it's working really great, including setting up materials. Even though I have to change the materials, still having materials preset is a great thing. Also, having the GNOME symbolics here, I do want to talk to whoever's responsible for the icon redesign in Blender, because what we're now doing, we used to do like this centralized approach where we'd have this amazing centralized theme with semantically correct naming and trying to maintain this for all the apps to be able to look up certain names. We're going away with that, and we're creating this asset library for app developers, really, that can incorporate in their applications. And it makes perfect sense to like synchronize the style, because similar goals are for our application as they should work, tiny symbolic icons. So I think, and we're creating this asset that is as well licensed as you can do to use it in any purpose. So it's going to be CC0, public domain, so that anybody can actually use that. Another amazing tool that we use is the dope sheet, because like you're tweaking timing. You don't want, when you're doing transitions, it's important to be able to like keep the image of spatial awareness, but you don't want to wait for things. You never want to feel like you're waiting for the system to update. So getting the timing right is important, and like general rule, 200 milliseconds works, but sometimes you want to be even faster. The dope sheet, again, amazing tool to be able to retime things quickly. I still like run, like after working so many years with it, sometimes like, especially with like the material nodes, some objects just don't populate the dope sheet sometimes. Constraints, another great tool for this kind of stuff. You don't want to manually, keyframe stuff that's supposed to move along. It's like animators not wanting the feet to slide on the floor when you're doing mocking up drag and drop, or things like sliders where like you're having a cursor that's moving a slider only linked at one axis, and all those things. If you were to keyframe that would be horrible. So that's really lovely. I'm going back to how the GLSL shader didn't quite work for me, and that was because a lot of times the state changes for something like a window, so you need to have multiple textures, and I was like alpha compositing textures on top of each other, try to blend, but like the Z order would get all flaky. And then with the Blender internal engine, like I could just do it with materials, but then the GLSL preview would be showing something different to what the actual render is. And then I would like it, when I was doing the getting started videos, I had a remote machine, a Jenkins instance, rendering, couple, like 15 languages, 50 or 60 gigabytes worth of frames, and I realized I made a mistake, sorry, to ruin everything. So having a real-time preview was an amazing benefit. So I had, when I switched to cycles throughout the project, it was amazing because I always had, apart from motion blur, I always had an accurate representation of what I'm gonna get when I render the thing, and that was brilliant. So I was using just animating the shaders, the textures in there. Another great thing is like this is a very dangerous kind of example, in that it combines the high fidelity with the wireframe. So you really need to know who you're working with, so you don't confuse and people don't like aim to like take the. But like working with GNOME developers is good. They don't do pixel by pixel implementation of a wireframe. However, what I wanted to show is the kind of a blur effect. That's also, I do my materials the way I do my coding, which is Google. So I just Googled that you can actually, to do blur, you can actually like introduce noise into the UV vector, and so it blurs, and it's amazing. So you can get animated effects like that. Also worth noting is, if you notice, I used the key functionality in Blender, which is metaballs here, like when the notifications fall down, you can see like the blobs kind of merging. The only reason why I'm here giving this talk is thanks to Jirka Hnidek, who was implementing the metaballs in Blender. So I was gonna, give a shout out to him, but unfortunately he didn't make it. So I'm giving a shout out to him through YouTube. Yeah, and that's pretty much what I wanted to say. I usually like get off on a tangent and blabber for longer than I should be. So I put this, I was gonna put it like at the front of the talk, where I talk about not being a 3D person, but I put it at the back, so I expected that I won't have time. I do, so I can talk about this little anecdote. This is very little time. Okay, so this is the pinnacle of my 3D abilities back at 232, which is, I spent like, I don't know, 2 weeks playing with this. This was Blender Eternal, no ray tracing, just put a little spotlight where the refraction was supposed to be. I did like shape keys and everything. I really, like, all my time went into this. And, Ton acknowledged all that work by saying, yeah, we should do simple tests like this to do a little PR for Blender as well. So this simple test took me 2 weeks, and got acknowledgement for that. All right, so thank you for a different kind of use of a 3D package than doing a TV production and film. And I hope you guys like the result and continue running GNOME.